The whistle of the 310 to Denver was a death sentence. It screamed across the scorched plains of the Oklahoma Panhandle, sealing Madeleine Corbin's fate. 38 years old, her body heavy with a child her husband had suddenly deemed an inconvenience, she stood alone on the splintered platform of the Redemption Gulch station. The train carrying her husband Barrett and all her worldly security shrank into a black speck against the brutal sun. Dust and humiliation were her only companions. Every averted gaze from the townsfolk was a fresh lash of shame. Then a shadow fell over her. A man weathered as the landscape itself stepped close, his voice a low rumble that cut through her despair. He didn't offer pity. He offered a terrifying, absolute claim. You're mine now. The heat was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket woven from dust and shimmering air. It pressed down on the tin roof of the Redemption Gulch station, on the warped planks of the platform, and on the very soul of Madeleine Corbin. Each tick of the station master's clock had been a countdown to this moment of absolute desolation. Just an hour before, this same platform had been the stage for the final act of her life's great tragedy. Barrett, her husband of 12 years, had stood before her, his face a mask of cold resolve. He was a handsome man, his features carved with the ambition that had once charmed her. Now that same ambition looked like cruelty. Madeleine, you must understand. He'd said his voice low, but carrying the sharp edge of finality. He avoided looking at the swell of her belly, the very reason for his brutal calculus. The partnership in Denver with the Wentworths. It's everything I've worked for. They expect a man unencumbered, a young wife, a fresh start, a delicate situation like yours at your age. It's a complication I cannot afford, at your age. The words had struck her harder than a physical blow. 38. In the drawing rooms of Boston, where she was raised, it was a respectable settled age. Here in the unforgiving West, where a woman's worth was measured in sons and seasons of hard labor, it was perilously close to old, and to be pregnant for the first time at such an age was seen as a risk, a folly, a complication. Barrett, please, she'd whispered, the plea swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. The baby, your baby. Where are we to go? I have left you sufficient funds for a room at the boarding house for a month, he stated as if discussing a business ledger. He'd pressed a thin envelope into her hand. It felt like an insult. After that, a woman of your resourcefulness should manage. This is goodbye, Madeleine. He hadn't kissed her. He hadn't even touched her arm. He had simply turned his polished boots, clicking a sharp, merciless rhythm, and boarded the train. He found his seat in the plush passenger car, never once looking back. She had watched him through the window, saw him straighten his tie, his gaze fixed firmly on the horizon, on his future. A future that had been violently amputated from her own. The train's departure had been a physical severing. The lurch of the cars, the chuff of the steam engine, the final piercing shriek of the whistle, it all tore through her, leaving a wound gaping and raw. Now she was a statue of shame. The few people milling about, a family heading east, a pair of dusty cowboys, the station master, Mr. Abernathy, all knew. They had heard the whispers, seen the rigid set of Barrett's jaw, and now witnessed the aftermath. They looked at her then, quickly away, as if her misfortune were a contagion. Her fine wool travelling suit, once a symbol of her status as the wife of a prosperous land surveyor, now felt like a costume on a fool. The sun beat down, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. The baby shifted, a heavy, insistent reminder of her predicament. She sank onto a hard wooden bench, the splintered wood digging into her thighs. The thin envelope of money lay in her lap. A month. A month in a town called Redemption Gulch, where she knew no one and was marked by the most public of scandals. After that, nothing. The abyss. Her mind a frantic whirlwind of panic could find no purchase. Her family in Boston had long since disowned her for marrying Barrett, a man they considered a coarse opportunist. She had staked her entire life on him believing in the dream he spun of a Western empire built on his surveying chains and her quiet fortitude. She had endured the dust, the isolation, the loneliness, all for a future that had just vanished with the train smoke. Tears threatened hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. To weep here, in front of these strangers, would be the final indignity. She wrapped her arms around her belly, a protective gesture that was as much for herself as for the child within. "We are alone," she thought the words a cold stone in her heart. Completely and utterly alone. That was when the shadow fell. It wasn't the fleeting shade of a passing cloud. It was solid-rooted. She looked up from under the brim of her hat, her eyes squinting against the glare. A man stood before her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed not in the tailored suits of men like Barrett, but in the functional, worn garb of the land itself. His denim trousers were faded, his leather boots scuffed and coated in the fine red dust of the territory. A low-slung gun belt rested on his hips with an unself-conscious ease that spoke of long familiarity. His face was the most arresting part of him. It was lean and weathered, tanned by 1,000 suns with lines etched around his eyes and mouth. They weren't lines of age but of experience. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of grey, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He looked dangerous. He looked like the very sort of man her father had warned her about, a man of the untamed frontier, governed by his own laws. She tensed, expecting him to mock her or perhaps offer some lewd proposition. Men often saw a lone woman as an opportunity. He did neither. He simply watched her for a long moment, his gaze missing nothing: the expensive but travel-worn dress, the pale, strained set of her face, the protective curve of her arms around her abdomen. His eyes flickered for a fraction of a second toward the empty tracks where the train had been. He knew. When he finally spoke, his voice was not what she expected. It was a low baritone, a gravelly rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. It held no pity, no mockery, no false sympathy. It held only a strange, unnerving authority. He took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather sagebrush and clean sweat. He leaned down, not in a threatening way, but to be heard without raising his voice. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, the relentless sun and the prying eyes of the town fading into a blur. His next words were whispered, meant only for her, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap. "You're mine now." Madeline stared at him, her mind a blank slate of shock. The words made no sense. They were the words of a madman or a captor. Yet in the terrifying abyss of her abandonment, they were also the first solid thing she had to hold on to. He wasn't asking. He was telling. He was staking a claim as one might claim a parcel of land or an untamed horse. Before she could process, before she could scream or flee, he straightened up. He turned his head and gave a short, sharp nod to someone behind her. She heard the crunch of boots on gravel and looked over her shoulder to see another man, older with a kind, wrinkled face and a drooping mustache, leading a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 placid mules. The stranger turned back to her. He held out a large, calloused hand. It was not a gentleman's hand. It was the hand of a man who worked, who fought, who held on and did not let go. "My name is Cole Garrett," he said, his voice back to its normal, quiet volume. "The wagon is here. We should go before the sun gets any higher." He stood there, his hand outstretched, his grey eyes unwavering. He was offering her an escape, but to what? From the slow death of shame and poverty at the station, to an unknown fate with a man who had just declared her his property. It was a choice between two terrors. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. Then she looked down at the envelope from Barrett, the 30 days of lonely disgrace it represented. In that moment, the known terror seemed infinitely worse than the unknown one. With a trembling breath that felt like her last tie to the woman she used to be, Madeleine Corbin placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm, and a jolt not of fear but of something else, entirely, something wild and terrifyingly alive, shot through her. The journey from Redemption Gulch was a silent, jarring affair. The wagon, a sturdy buckboard laden with sacks of flour and other supplies, groaned and swayed over the rutted track that passed for a road. The older man whom Cole had introduced simply as Gus handled the mules with a quiet expertise, his occasional clicks and murmurs the only sounds breaking the rhythmic creak of wood and leather. Madeleine sat beside Cole on the hard driver's bench. The proximity was unsettling. His thigh was a mere inch from her own, a solid, unyielding presence. She kept her posture ramrod straight, her hands clutching her reticule in her lap, trying to create an illusion of space where none existed. She was acutely aware of every detail about him, the way his worn shirt stretched across his broad back, the faint scar that nicked his left eyebrow, the steady, unhurried rhythm of his breathing. He was a universe of raw, masculine energy she had never encountered before. Barrett, with his polished manners and starched collars, had been a man of drawing rooms and contracts. This Cole Garrett was a man of the earth and the sky. He did not speak to her. After helping her onto the wagon with a surprisingly gentle hand, he had taken his seat and fallen into a contemplative silence, his gaze sweeping the landscape. He seemed to be reading the roll of the hills and the shapes of the clouds, as a scholar might read a book. Madeleine in turn stole glances at him, her mind racing. Who was he? Why had he done this? "You're mine now." The words echoed in her head, a terrifying and perplexing refrain. Was he a savior or an opportunist of a different, more primal kind? Perhaps he was a white slaver, a villain from the penny dreadfuls her maid used to read. But his eyes didn't seem cruel. They were hard, yes, and shadowed with things she couldn't guess at, but they weren't malicious. They were watchful. She tried to rationalize his actions. Maybe he was a lonely rancher who saw a desperate woman and made a crude, impulsive offer of marriage. In this part of the country, women were scarce, but the possessiveness of his declaration felt deeper than a simple proposal. It was a statement of fact, a transfer of ownership she hadn't agreed to. She had been Barrett's property until 3:10 p.m. Was she now Cole Garrett's? The thought sent a chill down her spine, despite the oppressive heat. They traveled for what felt like hours, heading west, away from the railroad, and into a landscape of rising mesas and sprawling rocky plains, dotted with hardy scrub oak and juniper. The sky was a vast, merciless blue. There was a raw, untamed beauty to it, but also an intimidating emptiness. It was a land that could swallow a person whole. Finally, Gus angled the mules toward a gap between two rust-colored buttes. The wagon rattled through a narrow canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side before emerging into a wide, secluded valley. Madeleine gasped. It was like stepping into a hidden world, a creek lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves shimmered silver in the breeze snaked through the valley floor. Green pastures impossibly lush in this arid land, spread out on either side, dotted with grazing cattle. And in the center of it all, nestled in a crook of the creek, was a ranch house. It was not a grand mansion, but it was large and solid, built of thick adobe walls and dark timber beams with a wide shaded porch running its full length. It looked rooted to the land, as if it had grown there. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. It was an oasis of order and life in the midst of a wild, chaotic world. This was the home of the man who had claimed her. Gus brought the wagon to a halt in the dusty yard in front of the house. The moment the wagon stopped, the front door opened, and a woman emerged onto the porch. She was a stout, middle-aged woman, with her greying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple, practical dress, and wiped her hands on an apron tied tightly around her waist. Her face was set in a permanent expression of disapproval. She looked at the wagon, her sharp eyes taking in the supplies, then Gus, then Cole. Finally, her gaze landed on Madeline. It lingered sharp and assessing, sweeping over Madeline's fine but dusty clothes and her unmistakable condition. The woman's lips thinned into a straight, hard line. Cole swung down from the wagon landing with a soft thud. "Martha," he said, his voice even. "This is Madeline Corbin. She'll be staying with us. Get the north bedroom ready for her." Martha did not move. Her gaze, cold and hostile, remained fixed on Madeline. "Staying with us?" She repeated, her voice tight with suspicion. "For how long we ain't running a boarding house for strays?" The insult was plain. Madeline felt her cheeks flush with heat. She, who had once hosted governors and senators in her Boston home, was now a stray brought in from the proverbial rain. Cole's posture didn't change, but a cold stillness settled over him. "She is my guest, Martha," he said, and the quiet authority in his voice was absolute. It wasn't a request. It was an order that brooked no argument. "The north bedroom, now." For a long moment, the two of them were locked in a silent battle of wills. Madeleine could feel the history between them, a long-standing friction. Finally, Martha broke eye contact, giving a curt, angry sniff. She turned without another word and disappeared back into the dark interior of the house, the slam of the screen door echoing in the yard. Cole turned back to the wagon, seemingly unperturbed. He offered his hand to Madeline again. "Welcome to the Triple Creek Ranch," he said, his tone unreadable. She hesitated, then took his hand and allowed him to help her down. Her legs were stiff, and she stumbled slightly as her feet hit the ground. His grip tightened for a second, steadying her before he let go. "Gus will see to your trunk," he said, gesturing to the single piece of luggage Barrett had allowed her to keep. He then led her toward the house. The interior was dark and cool after the glare of the sun. The main room was vast, dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The furniture was heavy, and masculine leather chairs, a large oak table, shelves filled with books and ledgers. Animal hides were strewn on the polished wooden floors. It was a space built for function, not for feminine comforts, yet it was meticulously clean. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and beeswax. Cole led her down a hallway to a closed door. "This will be yours," he said, opening it. The north bedroom was spacious and surprisingly pleasant. A large four-poster bed, covered with a thick patchwork quilt, stood against one wall. A simple wooden wardrobe, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a small writing desk completed the furnishings. A large window opened to catch the breeze, looked out over the creek and the green pasture beyond. It was a peaceful view. "Martha will bring you some water." "Rest," Cole said from the doorway. He paused, his hand on the frame. He looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face. "No one will harm you here, Mrs. Corbin." He used her formal name for the first time, and it was a strange comfort, a small acknowledgement of the person she had been. "Why?" The question burst from her, a desperate need to understand. "Why did you do this, Mr. Garrett? What do you want from me?" He watched her for a long time, his expression unreadable. She thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and flat. "Barrett Corbin owes me a debt," he said. "A very old one. I'm just collecting." He turned and walked away, his bootfalls receding down the hall, leaving Madeline standing alone in the middle of her new room, her new prison or her new sanctuary. She didn't know which. His words had answered nothing and everything. This wasn't about her at all. It was about Barrett. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a piece of property seized to settle a score. The knowledge was both terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. If this was about Barrett, then the shame of her abandonment was not entirely her own to bear. It had a history, a reason that preceded her. Later, Martha entered without knocking, her face still a thundercloud. She slammed a pitcher of cool water onto the washstand. "Supper is at sundown," she snapped. "Cole expects punctuality." She then turned and left as abruptly as she had come. Left alone, Madeline walked to the window. She watched the life of the ranch unfold. Cowboys on horseback moved cattle in a distant pasture. Gus unhitched the mules and led them to a corral. It was a world of purpose, of hard work, of survival. She pressed a hand to her belly where her child rested oblivious. A debt. Barrett had left a trail of debts, financial and moral, all over the territory. What had he done to this man, this Cole Garrett, to warrant such a strange and absolute form of vengeance? And what precisely did collecting entail for her? She was under his roof, under his protection, but also completely at his mercy. He had saved her from the station, but he had also stolen her from the world. As the sun began to dip below the mazes, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Madeleine Corbin finally allowed herself to weep. They were not the tears of a shamed wife, but the tears of a woman cast into the heart of a vast, dangerous mystery. The days at Triple Creek Ranch settled into a strange, disquieting rhythm. Madeline's life became a pendulum, swinging between long stretches of quiet solitude and moments of tense, charged interaction. Cole Garrett was a man of shadows and substance. He would be gone before sunrise, riding out with his men, a distant figure on horseback, against the vast landscape. He would return at dusk, smelling of dust and sweat, his face etched with the day's labor. He was a constant, powerful presence even in his absence. The entire ranch, the men, the work, even the formidable Martha revolved around him. He rarely spoke to Madeline, but she felt his eyes on her constantly. During the silent, perfunctory suppers at the big oak table, she would look up to find him watching her, his expression a mask she could not decipher. Was it calculation, pity, or something else? He made sure she had everything she needed: food, comfort, privacy. But he offered no warmth, no explanation. He was her keeper, her protector, and her jailer all in one. Martha remained a bastion of hostility. The housekeeper performed her duties with a resentful efficiency, serving Madeline her meals, cleaning her room, but refusing to engage in any form of conversation. Her silence was a constant accusation. To Martha, Madeline was an interloper, a disruption to the masculine order of the ranch, and worse, a woman of questionable morals brought home by the master without explanation. Madeline's only solace was Gus, the old ranch hand. He would often find a reason to be near the main house, mending a leather strap on the porch, or tending to the small vegetable garden Martha kept out back. He would tip his hat to Madeline and offer a gentle, "Mornin', Mom." His kind eyes a welcome respite from Martha's glare and Cole's intensity. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into her stay, Madeline found him sitting on the porch steps, carefully carving a piece of wood. She gathered her courage and sat on the porch swing, its gentle creak filling the silence. "Gus," she began softly. "You've worked for Mr. Garrett for a long time." Gus didn't look up from his carving, but a small smile touched his lips. "Knew him since he was a boy, Ma'am. Knew his father before him. This ranch, this was his father's dream." This was the first crack in the wall of silence surrounding Cole's past. "His father," Madeline prompted, trying to keep her voice casual. "John Garrett. A fine man. A dreamer." Gus said, his voice wistful. "Built this place from nothing. He saw the water in the creek and knew this valley could be something special. Cole's just like him, stubborn. Sees the world how he wants it to be and bends it to his will." Gus finally looked at her, his expression serious. John and his wife, Sarah, they loved this land more than anything. "What happened to them?" Madeline asked, her heart beating a little faster. Gus's smile faded. He set his carving aside. "Hard times, ma'am. About 14 years ago. A string of bad luck. Drought-sick cattle. John had to take a loan to keep the place afloat. He spat into the dust. Took it from the wrong man." A cold dread began to creep up Madeline's spine. "Who?" she whispered. A slick surveyor new to the territory. Gus said, his voice laced with old venom. "A man with a silver tongue and a black heart. Name of Barrett Corbin." Madeline felt the air leave her lungs. It was as if the ground had fallen away beneath her. Barrett. Of course. Gus continued, his eyes dark with memory. Corbin structured the loan with clauses and terms a plain rancher like John couldn't rightly understand. When the drought didn't break, Corbin called the note due. No extensions, no mercy. He took everything. The land, the cattle, the house. Everything John and Sarah had built. He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. The loss broke them. John. He took his own life a few months later. Couldn't bear the shame. Sarah, she just faded away. Died of a broken heart inside a year. Cole was only about 20. Lost it all. Had to watch Corbin's men ride in and brand his father's cattle with a new iron. The story hung in the air, thick and heavy with tragedy. Madeline saw it all, the ambitious young Barrett preying on a desperate man's hope, the devastation of a family, and the young Cole left with nothing but the ashes of his parents' dream. "But Cole has the ranch back now," Madeline said, her voice barely audible. "How he disappeared for a few years," Gus explained. "Went up to the silver mines in Colorado, they say. Worked like a man possessed. Lived on nothing, saved everything. While he was gone, Corbin, who never had a mind for ranching, sold this valley to some speculator from back east. Cole came back 5 years ago with a bag full of silver dollars and bought it all back. Every last acre. Been rebuilding it ever since." So that was it. The debt. It wasn't about money. It was a debt of blood and sorrow of a stolen legacy. And now Cole had reclaimed the land. But it wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted to wound Barrett in the same way he had been wounded. He wanted to take something Barrett valued. And Barrett, in his monumental arrogance, had delivered his wife and his unborn heir directly into his enemy's hands. The conversation left Madeline shaken to her core. She was no longer just a pawn. She was the living embodiment of Cole's revenge. He hadn't saved her out of kindness. He had seized her as a spoil of a long and bitter war. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west, the first rain since her arrival. The air grew heavy, and lightning spiderwebbed across the dark sky. Madeline couldn't rest. The knowledge of Cole's past churned within her. She left her room and walked down the hall to the main room. A single lamp was lit, casting a pool of golden light on the large oak table. Cole was there, bent over a large leather-bound ledger. He was so engrossed in his work, he didn't hear her approach. She stood in the shadows watching him. The lamplight carved his face into sharp angles of light and darkness. She could see the concentration, the weight of responsibility he carried. He was not the monster she had first imagined, nor the simple hero she had sometimes hoped for. He was a man forged in loss, driven by a righteous, all-consuming fury. She stepped into the light. "Gus told me," she said. Her voice was steady, stripped of its earlier fear. "He told me about your parents, about what Barrett did." Cole looked up his face, impassive, but his grey eyes were like storm clouds. He didn't deny it. He slowly closed the ledger. "Gus talks too much. He called the debt." Madeline continued, walking closer to the table. "He took your home, your family, and now you've taken me, his wife, his child, an eye for an eye. Is that it?" "It's not that simple," Cole said, his voice a low growl. "Isn't it?" She challenged, a strange fire igniting within her. She was no longer just a victim. She was a player in this drama, and she deserved to know the rules. "You stood on that platform and said, 'You're mine now.' Was I just a piece of property to be claimed, a way to wound a man who is now a stranger to me?" He rose from his chair, a towering figure in the dim light. He moved around the table until he stood directly in front of her. They were so close, she had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. "When I saw you on that platform," he said, his voice dropping, becoming intensely personal, "I didn't just see Corbin's wife. I saw a woman left to the wolves just like my mother was. I saw him casting you aside, the same way he cast my family aside when we were no longer useful to him. It was the same coldness, the same callous disregard." He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently touch a stray strand of hair that had fallen across her cheek. His touch was surprisingly soft, sending a shiver through her. "The debt is with Barrett," he said, his eyes holding hers. "But you are not the debt. You are the consequence. And I'll be damned if I let you suffer the same fate my mother did." In that moment, under the flickering lamplight with the storm raging outside, Madeleine understood. His motives were a tangled knot of vengeance and a fierce protective instinct he probably didn't even understand himself. He was driven by the ghost of his mother, the memory of her despair. In saving Madeleine, he was trying in some way to save her. "And the baby," she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. "The baby," he said softly, "is an innocent in all this. And this ranch, Triple Creek, it's a good place to be born, a place with roots." He was offering not just sanctuary, but a legacy, the very legacy Barrett had stolen from him. The irony was staggering. Cole Garrett intended to give Barrett Corbin's child the home and the heritage that Barrett had denied Cole. It was a revenge so poetic, so complete, it was breathtaking. The walls between them had not crumbled, but a door had been opened. Madeleine saw the man behind the mask, and he, perhaps for the first time, saw her as more than just a symbol of his revenge. She was a woman, a mother-to-be and a survivor. Just like him. The storm outside raged on. But inside the adobe house, the air was still charged with a new and terrifying understanding. While Madeleine was slowly piecing together the ghost-haunted history of the Triple Creek Ranch, Barrett Corbin was striding through the bustling, muddy streets of Denver, a world away. He had shed the skin of his old life as easily as a snake. The memory of his wife, standing forlornly on that desolate platform, was a minor inconvenience, a loose thread he had neatly snipped. His focus was entirely on the future, a future embodied by William Wentworth, a titan of industry with interests in mining, railroads, and banking. The partnership Barrett sought was not merely a business arrangement, it was an ascension. It was his ticket out of the dust and into the rarefied air of real power and old money. The linchpin of this deal was Wentworth's daughter Lydia. She was 22, elegantly beautiful, and possessed the brittle confidence of a woman who had never been denied anything. Barrett courted her with the same single-minded, predatory focus he applied to his business dealings. He presented himself as a self-made man of the West, widowed by a tragic illness that had claimed his frail older wife. It was a clean, sympathetic narrative, and Denver society, eager for a romantic story, consumed it readily. For weeks, everything went according to his plan. He dined at the Wentworth mansion, escorted Lydia to the opera, and spoke of grand futures over brandy and cigars with her father. He was on the cusp of having it all: wealth, status, and a young, fertile wife who would solidify his new dynasty. The first crack in his carefully constructed facade appeared in the form of a letter from his solicitor in the Panhandle, a man named Peterson, whom he kept on retainer to manage the dregs of his former life. Mr. Corbin, the letter began, "I write to inform you of a peculiar development concerning the property and assets you left behind. Following your departure, your wife, Mrs. Madeline Corbin, did not, as you instructed, take up residence at the boarding house in Redemption Gulch. Instead, she was seen leaving town in the company of Mr. Cole Garrett of the Triple Creek Ranch." Barrett's blood ran cold. Cole Garrett. The name was a spectre from a past he had tried to bury under layers of success and ambition. He remembered the boy's face, burning with impotent hatred as he had overseen the foreclosure. He had dismissed him as a piece of unfortunate collateral damage. He never imagined the boy would have the grit or the means to reclaim his father's land. The letter continued. Local gossip, which I hesitate to repeat, but feel obligated to report, suggests Mrs. Corbin is now residing at the Triple Creek Ranch as Mr. Garrett's ward. Given her delicate condition and the history between yourself and the Garrett family, the situation is giving rise to considerable speculation. I felt it my duty to inform you, should this complication have any bearing on your current affairs. Complication. The word mocked him. He crumpled the letter in his fist, his knuckles white. Garrett. That vengeful whelp had taken his wife, his pregnant wife. The public nature of it was a direct, calculated insult. Garrett wasn't just sheltering her. He was advertising his possession of her, flaunting it in the face of the very town where Barrett's authority had once been absolute. His first instinct was rage, a primal fury at the audacity of it. But close behind it came a cold, calculating fear. His story in Denver, the foundation of his entire enterprise, was built on the lie of a tragic widower. A living pregnant wife residing with his sworn enemy was more than a complication. It was a stick of dynamite placed at the base of his new life. If William Wentworth, a man who prized reputation above all else, were to learn of this, the deal, Lydia, everything would be lost. He had to get her back. Not out of any lingering affection that had withered long ago, but out of pure, pragmatic necessity. Madeline and the child were his assets, loose ends, that needed to be tied down, hidden away, until they were no longer a threat. His plans for Lydia Wentworth suddenly hit a snag. In a conversation on the veranda of her father's mansion, she had cooled toward him. "Father has been making inquiries, Barrett," she'd said, her voice like chilled wine. "He has associates in the Panhandle. They speak of discrepancies in your history, about your late wife." The trap was closing. Barrett realized his carefully crafted narrative was unraveling faster than he could stitch it back together. Pride and desperation warred within him. He had cast Madeline aside, believing her to be worthless. Now his entire future depended on reclaiming her. The irony was galling. He made his decision. He told the Wentworths that he needed to travel back to the Panhandle to finalize the sale of his former properties, a last piece of business, before he could fully commit to his new life in Denver. It was a plausible lie, and it bought him time. He packed a bag, but this time he also packed a new silver-plated Colt revolver. He was not going back as a surveyor or a businessman. He was going back as a man whose authority had been challenged, whose property had been stolen. He hired 2 men in a Denver saloon, rough characters named Flint and Decker, who asked few questions and looked capable of enforcing a man's will. He paid them well, telling them they were needed to help repossess some property from a recalcitrant squatter. The train ride south was fueled by a simmering rage. Every clatter of the wheels on the track was a countdown to his confrontation with Cole Garrett. He imagined the scene striding onto that ranch, the law on his side, and ripping Madeline from Garrett's grasp. He was the husband. She was his wife. The child she carried was his blood. No dusty backwater sheriff would dare to challenge his rights. He would not be shamed. He would not be beaten by the ghost of John Garrett. He would arrive in Redemption Gulch, not as a villain, but as a wronged husband, a pillar of society, come to rescue his poor, confused wife from the clutches of a kidnapper. He would spin the narrative to his advantage, just as he always had. He would paint Cole Garrett as a predator, and himself as the savior. As the familiar sun-scorched landscape of the Oklahoma Panhandle rolled past his window, Barrett Corbin felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He had built his life by taking what he wanted, by bending the world to his will, and discarding those who stood in his way. Madeline and Cole Garrett had made the fatal mistake of becoming obstacles, and Barrett was a man who cleared his own path. He was coming back to Redemption Gulch, not for redemption, but for reclamation, and he would let nothing and no one stand in his way. The arrival of Barrett Corbin in Redemption Gulch was not a quiet affair. He descended from the train onto the same platform where he had abandoned Madeline, but this time he was flanked by his 2 hired men, Flint and Decker. They were hulking, brutish figures whose presence alone was a statement of intent. Barrett, dressed in a fine city suit that stood in stark contrast to the dusty town, looked every bit the aggrieved man of substance. His first stop was the office of Sheriff Brody. Brody was a man past his prime, more interested in a quiet life than in confronting the powerful men who tended to shape the territory's fortunes. "Sheriff," Barrett began, his voice ringing with manufactured indignation, "I have come to report a crime. My wife, Madeline Corbin, a woman in a delicate and suggestible state, has been abducted. She is being held against her will by a man named Cole Garrett at the Triple Creek Ranch." Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had heard the gossip, of course. Everyone had, and most folks sided with Garrett. They remembered what Barrett had done to Cole's father. "Now hold on, Mr. Corbin," Brody said, stalling for time. "Abducted is a strong word. I heard she went with him willingly." "Willingly?" Barrett scoffed a perfect performance of disbelief. "Sheriff, the man is a known felon, a drifter who holds a baseless grudge against my family. He has taken advantage of my wife's confused state after a private marital disagreement. She is my wife. The law is quite clear on that matter. I demand you ride out with me immediately and restore my property to me." The word property hung in the air. Brody didn't like it, but the law, as Barrett stated, was indeed on the husband's side. Reluctantly, he agreed to form a posse. It wasn't much of one, just himself and his nervous young deputy. News of Barrett's return and the posse spread through the town like wildfire. It reached the Triple Creek Ranch via a young boy from a neighboring homestead who rode his pony Horde to deliver the warning to Gus. The atmosphere on the ranch, which had begun to settle into a fragile peace, instantly became taut with tension. Cole received the news with a grim stillness. He gathered his ranch hands, a dozen tough, loyal men who respected him and despised the memory of Barrett Corbin. "Barrett's coming," Cole said simply, his voice flat and hard. "He's got the sheriff with him. They'll call it law, but we know it's theft. No one has to stay. This isn't your fight." Not a single man moved. Gus spat on the ground, his expression resolute. "This ranch is our fight, Cole. Always has been." Inside the house, Madeline felt a wave of pure terror. Barrett was coming. The man who had discarded her was now coming to claim her, not out of love, but out of pride and necessity. She would be a prisoner again, her life and her child's life, subject to his whims. She found Cole by the corral, checking the action on his rifle. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's not setting foot on this land," Cole said, his jaw tight, "and he is not taking you." "Cole, he has the law with him," she pleaded. "They'll call you a kidnapper. They'll hang you." He finally looked at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes stunned her. "I lost this place once because of him, Madeleine. I lost my family. I will not lose it again. I will not lose you." The simple, stark declaration hung between them. It was the closest he had ever come to admitting what she had begun to suspect, that his quest for vengeance had become tangled up with a fierce, protective feeling for her and the child. He was no longer just righting an old wrong. He was defending his new future. As the afternoon sun began to dip, the posse appeared as a cloud of dust on the horizon. Cole positioned his men not for a bloodbath, but for a siege. They took cover behind the stone walls of the corral, along the roofline of the barn, their rifles ready. It was a show of force, a declaration that this land would be defended. Madeline was sent inside the thick-walled adobe house with Martha. The housekeeper, whose hostility had slowly softened into a grudging respect for Madeline over the past weeks, now looked at her with something akin to solidarity. "He's a devil, that Corbin," Martha muttered, barring the heavy front door. "Cole will see him to hell." The posse stopped at the gate to the valley 100 yards from the house. Sheriff Brody rode forward alone, holding up a hand for parley. "Garrett," he yelled, his voice thin in the vast open space. "Come on out. We've got a warrant for the return of Mrs. Corbin." Cole stepped out from behind the corral wall, standing exposed in the open yard. He held his rifle loosely at his side. "She's not a horse to be returned. Sheriff, she's here of her own free will." "That's for the law to decide," Barrett shouted, urging his horse forward to stand beside Brody, his face purple with rage. "Madeline, I am your husband. Come out of that house this instant." His voice, once the sound of her security, now sent a shard of ice through Madeline's heart. Peeking through a slit in the window shutters, she saw him arrogant and demanding, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would rather die in this valley than return to him. Suddenly, a sharp, stabbing pain shot through her lower back, making her gasp and clutch the windowsill for support. It came again, stronger this time, a deep, clenching cramp. Martha, seeing her pale face, rushed to her side. "What is it, child?" "The baby." Madeline breathed, another wave of pain washing over her. I think it's coming." Martha's eyes widened. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, "of all the cursed times." Outside, the standoff intensified. "I'm giving you 1 minute to send her out, Garrett, or we're coming in." Barrett threatened his hand, moving to the fancy revolver at his hip. "You set 1 foot on this property, Barrett." Cole's voice boomed back, cold and deadly. "And you'll be meeting your father in hell." Inside, Madeleine cried out, as a powerful contraction seized her. The world narrowed to a tunnel of pain. Martha, her earlier severity completely gone, became a model of frontier competence. "All right, child, all right," she soothed, helping Madeline toward the bedroom. "We'll manage. You're stronger than you think." The siege of Triple Creek had begun. Outside, a battle of wills over land and law. Inside, a far more primal battle, one of life and pain, had just commenced. The fates of everyone in that valley now hung on a razor's edge, caught between a madman's pride, a protector's vow, and the unstoppable force of a child determined to be born into the storm. The valley was a tinderbox, awaiting a spark. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows from the mesas, Barrett Corbin's patience finally snapped. His pride, savaged by the standoff, could endure no more. "I'm done waiting, Sheriff," he snarled, his voice a venomous tear in the fragile quiet. Ignoring Brody's protests, he spurred his horse forward, drawing his gleaming, silver-plated colt. His two hired men, Flint and Decker, fanned out their rifles ready. In response, a single warning shot cracked from the ranch, kicking up dust just in front of Barrett's horse. He barely flinched. "You'll have to do better than that, Garrett," he roared, drunk on his own fury. Then a sound from the house cut through the tension, a raw, piercing cry of agony. It was Madeline. The cry changed everything. It was no longer a dispute over property. It was an assault on a woman in the throes of childbirth. For Cole, the sound was a physical blow. The slow-burning fire of his 15-year vendetta erupted into a white-hot inferno. "Hold your fire," he commanded his men. Leaving his rifle behind, he vaulted the corral wall and began walking unarmed and resolute into the open yard toward Barrett. Barrett reined in a cruel, triumphant smile, twisting his lips as he leveled his revolver at Cole's chest. "Finally come to your senses, Garrett. Ready to give me what's mine." Cole stopped 20 feet away, his grey eyes like chips of ice. "This is over, Barrett," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're not taking anything else from this valley." As if summoned by his defiance, the front door of the ranch house creaked open. Madeline stood framed in the doorway, supported by a frantic Martha. Her face was a pale mask of sweat, but her eyes blazed with a fire that eclipsed her pain. "Barrett!" Her voice, though strained, was shockingly powerful, commanding the attention of every man present. He turned in the saddle, his sneer faltering. "Madeline, get back inside." "No!" she cried, taking a pained but steady step onto the porch. "I will not hide while you threaten the only man who has shown me decency. You speak of your honor. You have no honor, Barrett, and I am not your property." Each word was a hammer blow to his public facade. Sheriff Brody and his deputy stared, their expressions shifting from reluctance to open disgust. "You left me!" Madeline's voice rose, fueled by righteous fury. "You left me on that platform to be shamed, telling me I was too old and too much of a complication for your grand plans. You want your heir. You are not worthy of a child. You are not worthy of the title of husband or father." Her words exposed the lie at the core of his ambition, demolishing it in the open for all to hear. Humiliated, Barrett's face contorted with rage. He swung his revolver back toward Cole. "This is your fault, Garrett. You turned her against me." But as he aimed, Madeleine cried out again, clutching her belly as another contraction seized her. That raw, undeniable display of life and pain was the final trigger. Cole lunged. He moved with the force of a storm, closing the distance and yanking Barrett clean out of the saddle before he could fire. Barrett hit the ground hard, his pistol skittering into the dust. Cole hauled him to his feet, their faces inches apart. "It's over," he growled. When Flint and Decker raised their rifles, Sheriff Brody's authoritative voice stopped them cold. "Drop them. This is over. Mr. Corbin's complaint is dismissed." The hired guns, seeing the dozen rifles aimed at them from the ranch, wisely lowered their weapons. Cole shoved Barrett away in disgust. The man stumbled and fell a pathetic, dust-caked figure in his ruined suit. His power had vanished. Defeated, he scrambled onto his horse and rode away without a backward glance, his men trailing behind him. He was fleeing, not just the valley, but the ashes of his future. Cole turned and strode to the porch as Madeline's strength finally gave out. He swept her into his arms. "I've got you," he murmured, carrying her back into the sanctuary of the house. Hours later, as the first stars appeared, a new sound filled the valley, the thin, healthy wail of a newborn. In the quiet lamplight of the north bedroom, Cole stood watching the peaceful land he had almost lost again. Martha's soft voice came from behind him. "You have a son, Cole." He turned. Madeline was propped against the pillows, exhausted, but luminous. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was a tiny baby. He walked to the bedside, his heart tight. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and free of fear, a world of understanding passing between them. "Would you like to hold him?" she whispered. Carefully, reverently, Cole reached down and took the small, warm bundle. He looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face and the hard knot of grief and vengeance he had carried for so long finally dissolved. This was not the end of a war, but the beginning of a life. "He needs a name," Madeline said softly. A slow, genuine smile transformed Cole's weathered face. He looked from his son to the woman who had become his world. "His name," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is John." Madeleine's eyes filled with grateful tears. It was the perfect name, a new beginning that honored the past. She reached out her hand, resting on Cole's arm, a quiet anchor. He looked at her, at the child in his arms, and thought of the words he had first spoken in anger. He leaned down and whispered them again, their meaning now forged anew into a promise of love and devotion. "You're mine now." And so the story of Madeline Corbin and Cole Garrett concludes a powerful testament that the most brutal endings can forge the most beautiful beginnings. In seeking vengeance, he found redemption. In being abandoned, she found a strength she never knew she possessed. Their journey through the harsh frontier reminds us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we are brave enough to build and fight for. Home, they discovered, is not a place on a map, but a promise kept in the heart. If this story of resilience and love in the Old West resonated with you, please consider liking this video and sharing it. Subscribe to our channel for more tales of grit and redemption from the heart of the frontier. Thank you for listening.